I'm gonna start this video off with a bit of a controversial statement, probably. I don't like Celeste, pretty much at all, and it's probably surprising to fans of mine who know my taste in games. I love me a good old difficult action platformer, yet Celeste has never really done it for me. And there are multiple things about Celeste that I don't really like, but one of the big ones that I felt when I first played the game is that Celeste seemed like a game where I didn't really have any options to approach the platforming challenges in my own way. It seemed like the kind of game where my toolset was very limited and the level design was really restricted in such a way that it basically forced you to tackle every single room in the game in pretty much the one exact way it wants you to. I mean, sometimes you could approach things a little bit differently, but for the most part, it seemed like a very rigid game to me. I've since learned that there are some advanced mechanics in the game that it doesn't tell you about until way later into the post-game that do open things up, at least for like the initial game stuff, a little bit less so it seems like for post-game. But regardless, that wasn't my experience playing Celeste. I didn't figure any of that stuff out in my initial playthrough, so the game appeared to me as one that was really locked down, and it ultimately is what led to me having these thoughts. So I'm still going to use it as an example, even though it's maybe not the perfect game to use, but I'll talk about some other games that are definitely a lot more restricted in a little bit. But yeah, Celeste, when I played the game, I was constantly met with this feeling of limitation, because I didn't know any of the fancy stuff, and I didn't know how to put it to practical use. Most obstacles in the game, it appeared like there was only one really valid way to do it. So the platforming challenges would turn into this very specific sequence of actions that it wants me to do in a specific way, in a specific order, with specific timing. And while that's not inherently a bad thing, when I look at this, I don't see a platforming challenge, I don't see level design, I basically see a list of instructions. So many of the challenges in Celeste are so deliberately and carefully set up that there is this exact sequence that they want you to do. Even if there are some options to get around this stuff for more advanced players, at a base level, there is a prescribed correct way they want you to do these rooms, at least your first time through. Playing Celeste to me felt like putting together IKEA furniture. Step 1, dash here. Step 2, wall jump here. Step 3, land on this platform. And that's how pretty much the entirety of Celeste is designed. It's a game of following instructions, where the majority of the gameplay is identifying what the game wants you to do, and then just doing it. But again, Celeste does have some advanced stuff in there that makes what I've been saying not exactly for the case in this game. This was just my experience when playing it, and it made me realize I have a preference for more open-ended games versus games that are more closed off. But whatever, this video's not about Celeste. I was just using that as a springboard because my experience with that game led me to this realization. If we want to talk about a game that is definitely as locked down as it appears to be, we could talk about something like Corn Kids 64. This is like a Banjo-Kazooie style collectathon 3D platformer, but it has a lot of linear obstacle course platforming sequences, and when I first played this game, I had very similar feelings to it to when I played Celeste. You actually have a very robust toolset in this game. Lots of different moves you have for lots of different kinds of platforming maneuvers that would be really cool if you could take advantage of these in creative ways. But, once again, the challenges are so tightly controlled that the entire gameplay here is nothing more than identifying and execute the specific thing the game wants you to do. And certainly that can be a great source of fun in a game, puzzling and deciphering out the level design in front of you and figuring out what you're supposed to do, and then the skill necessary to actually do it. But something like Corn Kid 64 is definitely not a challenging game. It's not something that's going to push your skills, so I don't really get anything out of the actual act of doing the platforming here. And similarly, because I have played so many games like this, my ability to identify what a game wants me to do in these kinds of situations is really fast. Because games like this have a specific way they want you to play, their design inherently requires locking out all your other options, and that makes it pretty easy to figure out what the game wants me to do because it's obviously the only thing that's actually viable in this situation. So the entire gameplay of something like this basically turns into autopilot for me. I walk into the room, very quickly figure out what I'm supposed to do, and then do it with not that much effort. It just becomes going through the motions, and I don't really get anything from a game like this. But when I compare something like this to, say, the original Super Mario Bros., I find this game to be way more fun. You'd think that a game this old would be very limited in how you can play it, but actually it's quite an open-ended game. While you do have very small and linear levels, you can tackle them however you want. You can play things more slow-paced, try to collect as many coins and power-ups and lives as you can, or you can play as fast as possible, blazing forward at breakneck speeds, maintaining your momentum throughout the entire level. And that ability to choose how to play the game the way you want is built into the design of something like Mario. If you look at a lot of the platforming setups in this game, there is no one correct way the game wants you to do this. Sure, there are platforms, and they're there for you to jump on them, but thanks to the variable movement speeds of this game, you can make pretty long jumps, and you can fly over a number of these platforms and make really precise jumps where you land on just a one-by-one block and use that to keep on going, jumping on enemies and bouncing off them for greater height and distance. You don't just have to jump on the platform because that's the only thing you can do, and that's what the game wants you to do. And I find this kind of approach to a platformer way more fun because really there's just more game here. You still have the need to look at the level, identify how you're going to tackle it, and then use your skill to execute that. But there's an additional layer here of figuring out how you want to tackle it. While the gameplay here is a lot more simple than something like a Corn Kid 64, I find it a lot more interesting because here I'm making decisions. I'm thinking about how big of a risk do I want to take. I'm trying to figure out if I even can make that jump. That's one of the fun things about an open-ended game like this, pushing against the possibilities of what even is a viable option. In a more rigidly designed platformer, stuff either works or it doesn't, but in a more open-ended game, you can try something and you might fail at it, but you go, wait a minute, hold on. If I do this a little bit differently, maybe this can work. You get this experimentation and the ability to evolve the way you play. In a more rigidly designed platformer, because there's only one way to play, really, every time you replay the game, it's just doing the same thing again. Whereas a game like this, when you replay it, you have the option to tackle things in a different way than you did before. Maybe in the first playthrough, you played things very safe, but now you're better at the game, you're more confident, so you're going to try to play a little faster, a little riskier. These kinds of games have basically a free dynamic difficulty system because the player has the ability to choose how difficult they want their approach to the game to be. And even if you have already played in a risky, fast style, when you come back to the game, you might discover new ways to go even faster. They're even more difficult than what you did before. The game and your approach to it can change over time. You essentially get more level out of the same level because there are multiple levels contained within it, just depending on how you want to tackle the obstacles ahead of you. And even if you hit the point of near speedrunner optimization, where now the level is essentially a series of things that you do in a specific order, you still had this big period of experimentation before that you just don't get with a more controlled platformer. There are a lot of reasons that I absolutely prefer a more open-ended platformer to a more prescribed one. But that's not to say that this is an objectively better way to design a game. It's just different and personally much more to my preferences. But there are definitely a number of more rigid platformers that I absolutely still like, and it's usually because they do something to spice up that kind of gameplay a little bit more for me. Something like Pizza Tower, for example. That's another game where everyone was like, oh my god, it's the best thing ever, and I still wasn't really in love with it. I like it, I think it's a very good game, but I wasn't losing my mind over it like everyone else is. And Pizza Tower is definitely on the looser side of things, but because of the way the game's ranking and score system works, it does still have a correct way the game wants you to play. You know, if you want to get those P ranks, then you basically have to do the level all in one clean sequence, following the path that's been laid out in front of you. You know, getting all the collectibles, killing all the enemies, not taking any damage, and deviating away from that really just means you're screwing up in that game. And I still don't love that aspect to it, but what I do enjoy about Pizza Tower is how fast-paced it is and how many mechanics it has, because it makes it a lot harder to identify what the game wants me to do. I have more options to sift through and less time to figure out what the game wants me to do, and that does a better job of keeping me on my toes and engaged. There's also something like Kaze and the Wild Mass, which is a very much Donkey Kong Country-inspired game, and it has many similar gameplay elements to those games. And yeah, the levels are pretty rigid and don't give you that many options, but due to having that classic DKC roll and jump out of the air, and you get a little hover move similar to Dixie Kong, it gives you a little bit of open-endedness. And I think the pace of a game like this really helps a lot. It's very peppy. You know, it's not as fast as something like a Pizza Tower. Like, that game, a big part of it is reacting to the level as it's coming at you so quickly. Here, it's not as much about testing your reflexes, but things come at you quickly enough that it feels like I'm constantly identifying and tackling obstacles as soon as they come on screen. You know, it's jump, 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 bounce on an enemy, do a spin jump off a ledge, and then hover a long distance, land on the next platform, do a spin jump off that. It's much more faster paced than something like Corn Kids 64, which is pretty slow going. Though I do still like Corn Kids 64, while I find the platforming gameplay not like the most amazing thing in the world compared to a lot of other action platformers I like, compared to a lot of like collectathon games like actual Banjo-Kazooie, this is miles better than that. And the fact that this isn't just like a get to the end of the obstacle style game helps with that a lot. I'm more forgiving to the fact that the platforming here is kind of autopilot, because it's not the entire game. You got exploration, you're doing puzzles, you're interacting with the environment in cool ways, so it still works there to me. And difficulty is another way to make these kinds of games really work for me. Sybil here is a Crash Bandicoot style game, but with the difficulty cranked up to a ridiculous degree. And here it's like, yeah, it's easy to tell what the level wants me to do, but doing it is absolutely not easy, and it makes it feel less like just going through the motions, and more like I need to develop my skills to accomplish what the game is asking of me. But at the end of the day, I will absolutely take a game that puts me in the driver's seat and lets me make decisions about how I want to play well over any game that tells me what to do. Games like Freedom Planet 2 or Cloud Built, games that are really open-ended, where you can tackle any obstacle in the game in a million different viable ways. Games where it doesn't tell you how to play, games where figuring out how you want to play is part of the game. Again, not saying that one style of game is better than another, it's just my preference. Many people find more open-ended platformers a bit overwhelming, or can have a lot of the nuance and cool options in the game fly over their head and they never see what makes these kinds of games so cool. I mean, that's what happened to me with Celeste after all. But another thing to give some credit to some more limited platformers is I hear a lot of people like that these games are really tight in their design. A common complaint I hear about many open-ended platformers is that a lot of the gameplay becomes about circumventing the game rather than playing it. So many of these games have really powerful movesets that allow you to very easily fly over so much of the platforming. They feel it makes the game too easy, like you're just looking for the path of least resistance and you don't end up engaging with a lot of the potentially fun design of the game. And I totally get that, and I would even agree with it in some circumstances, but I really think it depends on a per-game basis. I think with this kind of thing, you really gotta strike the right balance between allowing the player to get crazy with really cool movement mechanics, but making it so it's not too easy or too free or too overpowered. An example of this that I think is really bad would be the Crash Bandicoot series. You know, Crash Bandicoot 1, really locked down game, you really have no options, and because of that, it's quite a difficult game. But then you jump to Crash 3 and you get all these extra moves, and now you can do high jumps into double jumps and the tornado spin, and you can just fly over so much of the level design. And it really makes the game kind of lame in my opinion, and easily my least favorite of the original Crash trilogy. It's just way too easy and not at all interesting. But then, if I compare it to something like Kitsune Tales, this is a game inspired by the 2D Mario games, and it's got two playable characters. First, you have to play through the game as Yuzu, who basically plays exactly like Mario, And just like the 2D Marios, there's some open-endedness in here, but you can't go too crazy with things. But then once you beat the game the first time, you unlock the second playable character, Kiri, that has a much more expanded moveset. She can do air dashes and upward dashes, and she gets an air jump that refreshes every time you attack an enemy, and your other 2 dashes also refresh every time you do. So you have this really powerful movement that totally lets you just fly over a bunch of the level design. And yeah, it undeniably does make the game a lot easier than when you have to do all this platforming legit as Yuzu. But unlike Crash 3, this isn't totally free. You still have to play well here. You have to pay attention, you have to consider what moves you used and which ones haven't been refreshed yet. You gotta make sure that you're hitting enemies to keep your abilities up. You gotta land on platforms every so often. You need some precision and control to maintain your speed and actually pull off all this crazy stuff. Here, I think this is a really good example of having really powerful movement that enhances a game and makes it more fun without making it so easy that you're barely even playing the game anymore. Plus, this game has the benefit of having the 2 playable characters, one that really forces you to engage with the level design, and then one that lets you go crazy. Now that I think about it, that's another big benefit of having open-ended design to a platformer like this. You can create different characters that have different movesets that can tackle the same level in different ways, and you get a different experience depending on who you're playing as. That's something that you can't get if you want that really hyper-controlled level design. At the same time, though, another thing that you get from that kind of control is you can make a game a lot harder, because naturally with such a robust moveset, if you want open-ended design, then it kinda does become a little bit difficult to make stuff that's really, really challenging. Unless the level designers are really careful to consider every single way the player can approach any obstacle you throw at them, there's probably gonna be some relatively easy way that a player can fly over things. Whereas in a more locked-down game, if the player has to do what you tell them to do, then you can make something really hard. Using Kitsune Tales as an example again, once you beat the game, you unlock some post-game ultra-hard like Kaizo-style levels, and doing them as Yuzu is really freaking difficult, but it's also quite a good time if you can rise to the occasion. Whereas if you replay these levels as Kiri, you find that these levels are nowhere near as fun because they're nowhere near as difficult anymore. They lose the reason they're even here to begin with. Now granted, I think in this case it's because these levels are clearly designed specifically for Yuzu and they didn't really worry too much about what Kiri's experience here would be. But still, it does at least show that you can play the exact same level with both an open-ended and limited moveset, and sometimes the more limited moveset can be the more fun way to play. So there is still definitely a place for more rigid and controlled platformers, as much as I do prefer ones that are more open-ended. Really just comes down to how you execute either of these design styles. Anyway, hope you found that interesting. If you have any thoughts on this topic, why you might prefer one style of game versus another, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear what people have to say on this. Game design is a fascinating topic to me, and I hope to have many more interesting discussions just like this one. And I hope to see you there.